At 6:23 a.m., on April 13, 1945, Lieutenant Commander James Patterson stood on the deck of LSM-43, watching a massive concrete fortress rise from Manila Bay like a ship frozen in stone. This was Fort Drum. The locals simply called it the concrete battleship. It was a monstrosity of engineering, 350 feet long, 144 feet wide, with reinforced walls 20 feet thick. For the last 36 hours, American forces had hammered it with a biblical fury heavy artillery, relentless naval gunfire, and bombers dropping 2,000-pound shells. The result? Nothing. The fortress had not even cracked. Inside those impregnable walls, 68 Japanese soldiers waited in relative comfort. They had food for 6 months, fresh water for 3, and enough ammunition to turn the bay into a kill zone for a year. The Americans could have bombarded Fort Drum until 1946 and barely scratched the surface. But Patterson had a different plan. A plan so reckless it terrified his own superiors. Instead of trying to break through 20 feet of reinforced concrete from the outside, he would walk right in the front door. The plan was insane. The execution was worse. And in 4 hours, those cold concrete walls would become a crematory that burned for 6 days straight. To understand why Patterson's plan was considered suicidal, you first have to understand the anomaly that was Fort Drum. It did not start its life as a fortress. It began as Fraile Island, a jagged, unassuming rocky outcrop jutting out of the mouth of Manila Bay. Standing 40 feet above sea level, it was situated in a perfect, albeit dangerous strategic position. Any ship hoping to enter Manila harbor had to pass within lethal range of this rock. In 1909, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers looked at that island and saw more than just a navigational hazard. They saw a potential weapon. But they did not want to build on the rock. They decided to replace it entirely. The audacity of the project was staggering for the early 20th century. It took 9 years of grueling labor to complete. First, engineers blasted away the natural rock until only a flat bedrock foundation remained, essentially decapitating the island. Then, they built massive wooden forms and poured concrete layer after layer, creating walls 20 feet thick on all sides. These were not just simple walls. The concrete was reinforced with heavy steel mesh every 6 inches, creating a composite armor that was arguably stronger than the steel plating of any battleship afloat. By 1918, Fraile Island was effectively erased from a map. In its place stood Fort Drum, a concrete battleship that could not move, could not sink, and was virtually immune to the conventional weapons of the era. The Americans called it the strongest fortress in the world, and they were not exaggerating. Inside the massive structure, they installed 2 14-inch gun turrets, with each assembly weighing a crushing 300 tons. These guns could hurl a shell 15 miles with terrifying accuracy. Deep in the bowels of the concrete beast, ammunition magazines held 1,000 shells per gun, and the garrison quarters were designed to house 200 soldiers comfortably, isolated from the world for 6 months at a time. It was a masterpiece of military engineering, but on May 6, 1942, the same day the fortress island of Corregidor fell, the masterpiece changed hands. The Japanese captured Fort Drum and immediately recognized the prize they had seized, an unsinkable battleship permanently blocking the throat of Manila Bay. They moved in 68 elite men from the 17th Independent Mixed Regiment engineers, gunners, and radio operators skilled enough to operate the complex machinery. For 3 years, Fort Drum became the lock on the harbor. No Allied ship could enter to resupply without risking immediate destruction. The 14-inch guns could break a cruiser's spine with a single hit, while the fort itself simply shrugged off retaliatory fire. By April 1945, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically. American forces had retaken most of the Philippines, but they faced a critical logistics nightmare. To supply the massive invasion force gathering for the final assault on the Japanese mainland, they desperately needed the deepwater port of Manila, but Fort Drum stood as the last stubborn obstacle. It was a standoff. 68 Japanese soldiers inside an impregnable box were holding up the entire Pacific Theater supply chain. Standard siege tactics were useless against 20-foot walls that had been cured to the hardness of granite. Assault troops could not land without being cut to ribbons by overlapping fields of machine gun fire. The U.S. Navy had a 4,000-ton concrete problem, and time was running out. Patterson studied the gray behemoth through his binoculars from the bridge of his landing ship, calculating the impossible angles. The vessel under his command, LSM-43, was an ugliness of utility, a landing ship medium, essentially a floating shoebox designed to vomit tanks onto sandy beaches. It had a flat bottom, a shallow draft, and heavy armor plating, capable of carrying 200 tons of war material directly into the teeth of enemy fire. But Patterson was not planning to land on a beach. He was planning to dock a ship against the vertical walls of a fortress in the middle of the ocean. The top of Fort Drum was a flat concrete plateau, sitting 40 feet above the waterline like the deck of an aircraft carrier. The Japanese defenders knew their position was strong. They had installed heavy machine gun nests around the perimeter, controlling every approach vector. Any standard landing craft attempting to get close would be turned into a colander by concentrated fire long before it reached the walls. However, Patterson had identified the one fatal flaw in the fort's design. The fortress's greatest strength, those 20-foot thick walls that made it impregnable to shells, also served as a prison. There were only two ways for air to get in or out: the main armored entrance at the water level, which was welded shut and heavily guarded, and the ventilation hatches on the roof. The logic was brutal and simple. If Patterson could get men onto the roof, he could seal the ventilation system. Once those vents were controlled, Fort Drum would cease to be a fortress and become a sealed concrete box. And a sealed box could be filled with whatever Patterson wanted to put inside. On April 12th, the crew of LSM-43 began loading their ship with a cargo that confused the regular supply officers. They were not loading ammunition or rations. They were loading industrial demolition equipment, heavy-duty pumps, 500 feet of reinforced flexible hose, and massive storage tanks. Inside those tanks sat 3,000 gallons of a terrifying concoction Patterson had devised himself. It was a precise chemical recipe for destruction: 60% diesel fuel for a long, hot burn, 30% aviation gasoline for rapid, explosive ignition, and 10% heavy motor oil. The motor oil was the cruelest addition. It was there to create thick, cloying smoke that would cling to surfaces and choke the air filters of gas masks. The plan was terrifying in its execution. LSM-43 would have to approach Fort Drum at high speed to minimize exposure to the guns. The ship's armor would have to absorb the punishment just long enough to ram the side of the fortress. Then came the hard part. Patterson would lower his massive bow ramp not onto sand, but onto the roof of the fort itself, effectively building a bridge between his ship and the enemy stronghold. He would storm the deck with a platoon of 40 hand-picked Marines. While the Marines suppressed the Japanese gunners and secured the ventilation hatches, the engineers would drag the heavy hoses across the ramp and pump the fuel mixture directly into the lungs of the fortress. Once the interior was saturated with flammable vapor, they would ignite it. The resulting thermobaric effect would consume every molecule of oxygen inside, suffocating anyone who survived the initial blast. Patterson knew the risks were astronomical. If the Japanese 37mm anti-aircraft guns damaged LSM-43's engines during the approach, the ship would be dead in the water, trapped alongside the fortress walls like a sitting duck. If they damaged the hydraulic bow ramp, the Marines would never reach the roof. If a stray bullet hit the pumping equipment or the fuel tanks on the deck of the LSM, Patterson and his crew would be incinerated instantly. But conventional tactics had failed for 36 hours, and every hour the fort remained operational delayed the invasion of Japan. On the morning of April 13th, the order was given. The concrete battleship was about to meet its match. At 0600 hours on April 13th, the engine telegraph on LSM-43 rang for all ahead full. The ship surged forward, churning the dark waters of Manila Bay into a white wake as it began its death run. The distance to the target was 2,000 yards. Speed 15 knots. On the roof of Fort Drum, Japanese observers spotted the low silhouette of the landing craft separating from the American fleet. At first, they likely assumed it was another probing mission or perhaps a foolish reconnaissance attempt. They had repelled dozens of assaults before. They settled into their firing positions, confident in their invulnerability, unaware that they were watching their own executioner approach. At 1,500 yards, the silence broke. The Japanese opened fire with everything they had on the roof. Heavy machine guns chattered, and rifle fire sparked off the steel hull of LSM-43. Inside the ship, the sound was deafening, a chaotic symphony of metal striking metal, sounding like hail hammering on a tin roof during a hurricane. Patterson, gripping the wheel, held his course steady. He knew the small arms' fire could not penetrate the ship's armor, but the real danger was waiting at the 1,000-yard mark. That was the effective range of the fortress's perimeter defense guns. As they crossed the 1,000-yard line, the fortress's main defensive batteries opened up. Crucially, the massive 14-inch turrets remained silent. They were designed to hit battleships over the horizon and could not depress their barrels low enough to target a ship this close. Instead, the Japanese relied on 37mm anti-aircraft guns mounted along the concrete parapets. The first salvo screamed overhead, missing high. The second salvo bracketed the landing craft, sending geysers of salt water erupting on both sides of the hull. The water crashing onto the deck was mixed with shrapnel. At 500 yards, the situation became personal. Through the viewing slits of the armored bridge, Patterson could see individual Japanese soldiers running across the fortress roof, frantic now, setting up additional machine gun tripods. They finally realized this was not a probe. The American ship was not turning away. At 200 yards, LSM-43 took its first serious hit. A 37mm shell punched cleanly through the portside armor plating and exploded inside the troop compartment. 3 Marines went down in a spray of blood and steel, but the ship did not falter. At 100 yards, Patterson ordered the engines to emergency power. The diesel screamed as the landing craft surged, closing the final gap. The Japanese gunners, overwhelmed by the speed of the approaching target, could not traverse their weapons fast enough. Their fire went wild, tracers arcing harmlessly into the sky. At 50 yards, Patterson could see the fear on the faces of the defenders, officers shouting orders, riflemen firing desperately from behind concrete barriers. Then came the impact. LSM-43 slammed into the side of Fort Drum at 12 knots. The collision threw every man on deck to their knees and sent a shudder through the ship that threatened to snap its keel. The massive bow ramp crashed down onto the fortress roof with a grinding, metallic screech that echoed across the entire bay. Before the dust had even settled, Patterson was the first man moving. Brandishing a .45 caliber submachine gun, he charged up the ramp and onto the roof of the enemy fortress. Behind him, a wave of 40 Marines followed, firing from the hip as they ran. The Japanese defenders had expected an amphibious assault from the water, or perhaps paratroopers. They were completely unprepared for a platoon of Marines storming their roof from a ship parked at their front door. The firefight was brutal, intimate, and short. It lasted exactly 12 minutes. The Japanese fought bravely from their prepared positions, but they were stunned by the violence of the boarding action. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and for the first time in the war, the walls of Fort Drum offered them no protection against the enemy standing right on top of them. With the roof secured, the roar of gunfire was replaced by the frantic shouting of engineers. The Marines had cleared the deck, but they were just the opening act. The real weapon was about to be deployed. Sergeant Mike Kowalski, a veteran of the island hopping campaigns, reached the main ventilation intake first. It was a massive steel grate, 4 feet square, heavily protected by sandbags and barbed wire evidence that the Japanese knew this was their Achilles heel. Kowalski did not hesitate. He dropped 2 fragmentation grenades through the grate, waited for the dull thump-thump of explosions below, and then signaled the all clear. The ventilation shaft dropped straight down into the bowels of Fort Drum 30 feet deep, 4 feet wide, and lined with riveted steel plates. Standing at the edge, Kowalski could hear voices echoing up from the darkness. He heard Japanese soldiers shouting conflicting orders and the heavy scrape of equipment being dragged across concrete floors. They knew the Americans were on the roof. They were preparing for a traditional siege, setting up kill zones in the corridors, expecting Marines to rappel down with rifles. They had no idea that what was coming down that shaft was not a man, but a liquid nightmare. While the Marines held the perimeter, Patterson's engineers dragged the heavy industrial pumps across the deck of LSM-43 and onto the fortress roof. They uncoiled 500 feet of reinforced rubber hose, snakes of black rubber slithering toward the open vents. The connection was made. The order was given. At 0645, the pumps roared to life. The fuel mixture, that deadly Navy cocktail of diesel, gasoline, and motor oil, began to flow at a steady rate of 50 gallons per minute. It cascaded down the ventilation shafts, splashing against the steel walls, atomizing into a fine, heavy mist as it hit the impeller fans below. Inside the fortress, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The air began to smell different, sweet, chemical, and cloying. Deep in the command center, Lieutenant Colonel Suzuki, the fortress commander, realized with horror what was happening. He was an engineer himself. He understood the physics of ventilation. The Americans were not trying to invade. They were turning his impregnable fortress into a combustion engine. Suzuki barked orders to shut down the ventilation fans, but it was too late. Gravity was doing the work now. The heavy fuel vapor, denser than air, was sinking. It flowed like water, creeping under blast doors, seeping through keyholes, and settling into the lowest magazines where the men had taken shelter. The motor oil in the mixture coated the walls and floors, ensuring the fuel would stick to everything it touched. The gasoline vapor began to saturate the air, turning the oxygen in the hallways into a high-grade explosive. Suzuki ordered his men to seal every interior bulkhead, hoping to create air pockets safe from the fumes. But the fortress was designed to circulate air efficiently to clear gun smoke. That same efficient design now ensured the lethal vapor reached every corner, every bunk, and every storage locker. At 0723, the pumps on the roof finally sputtered and fell silent. The silence was heavier than the gunfire. All 3,000 gallons of the mixture had been injected. Fort Drum was no longer a military installation. It was a 4,000-ton bomb waiting for a spark. Every breath the 68 defenders took brought the explosive fuel deeper into their lungs. They were drowning in gasoline vapor, waiting for the inevitable. Patterson faced one final engineering challenge: ignition. Lighting 3,000 gallons of fuel vapor inside a sealed concrete box is not as simple as striking a match. If the ignition was too weak, the vapor might just flash burn in pockets, leaving defenders alive. If it was too slow, the pressure would vent harmlessly. To turn Fort Drum into a total kill zone, Patterson needed intense, sustained heat applied simultaneously across the vapor cloud. He needed a reaction that could not be extinguished. That meant thermite. The demolition team had hauled up 200 pounds of it. Thermite is a nasty piece of chemistry, a mixture of rust iron oxide and aluminum powder that, when ignited, triggers a chemical reaction reaching 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That is hot enough to melt through engine blocks, liquefy steel beams, and ignite fuel vapor even in damp conditions. But Patterson added a second layer of insurance: white phosphorus. While thermite provided the heat, white phosphorus provided the persistence. It is pyrophoric, meaning it ignites on contact with air, burns underwater and continues to burn until it is physically deprived of everything it can oxidize. Even after the initial explosion sucked the oxygen out of the fortress, the white phosphorus would keep burning, consuming any remaining fuel pockets and generating toxic smoke to finish off anyone the blast missed. At 0730, the team lowered the charges. Thermite igniters were suspended deep in the main shaft. White phosphorus grenades were rigged in the secondary vents. Timed fuses were set for simultaneous detonation. Beneath their feet, the Japanese soldiers could surely hear the preparations, the clanking of metal, the hurried footsteps. Suzuki likely gathered his 68 men in the deepest, most fortified chamber, clutching their rifles, preparing to fight an enemy they could not see. But the enemy was not coming down the stairs. At 0745, Patterson gave the order to abandon the roof. The Marines and engineers scrambled back onto LSM-43. The ship threw its engines into reverse, peeling away from the concrete wall and backing 500 yards out into the safety of the bay. The crew crouched behind the heavy armor plating, counting down the seconds. At 0747, the timers hit 0. The explosion was not just a sound. It was a geological event. A massive pillar of orange flame erupted from every opening in Fort Drum, shooting 200 feet into the tropical sky. The main ventilation shaft transformed into a solid rocket booster. The pressure inside was so catastrophic that the fortress's 1-ton steel maintenance hatch was sheared off its hinges and hurled through the air like a frisbee, splashing down into Manila Bay, 400 yards away. The shockwave shattered windows in downtown Manila, 8 miles across the water. Seismographs as far away as Australia reportedly picked up the tremor. But the initial blast was just the opening note of the requiem. As the fuel ignited, the interior of the fortress transformed into a blast furnace. The white phosphorus continued to burn, driving the temperature inside to over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. From the deck of LSM-43, Patterson watched the aftermath. It was not just smoke rising. The concrete itself seemed to be bleeding heat. Steam hissed violently where the waves lapped against the superheated walls. The fire did not go out that afternoon. It did not go out that night. It burned for 6 days straight. On April 14th, flames were still licking the vents. On April 16th, the walls were still too hot to touch. It was not until April 19th that the concrete battleship finally cooled enough for the living to enter the domain of the dead. It was not until April 19th, nearly a full week after the attack, that the temperature dropped enough for American engineers to attempt an entry. Patterson led the first team inside. The main entrance, a massive blast door designed to stop naval artillery, had been blown off its hinges by the internal pressure of the explosion. It lay twisted on the concrete, peeled back like tinfoil. Beyond that broken doorway lay absolute darkness and a silence so profound it felt heavy. The interior of Fort Drum had been transformed into a surreal landscape of destruction. The heat had been so intense that it had not just burned. It had reshaped the very architecture of the fortress. Steel bulkheads had melted and dripped like wax, re-solidifying into twisted, abstract sculptures. The concrete walls were webbed with stress cracks from the thermal expansion, and the air still shimmered with residual heat. Patterson's team found the first bodies just 20 feet inside the entrance Japanese soldiers who had tried to sprint for the exit when the first explosions hit. They had not made it 10 steps. The superheated air had seared their lungs instantly. They died where they fell, their bodies strangely preserved, mummified by the intense heat that had sterilized the entire fortress. Deeper inside, the devastation was absolute. Steel equipment had fused into solid metal blocks. In the ammunition magazines, thousands of rounds had cooked off, but because of a lack of oxygen, they had not detonated conventionally. Instead, the casings were welded to the storage racks. In the fortress's deepest chamber, Patterson finally found Lieutenant Colonel Suzuki and his remaining 44 men. They had gathered in what they thought was the safest location, protected by the thickest concrete. But the walls that protected them from the blast had also trapped the heat, turning the room into an oven. The bodies were positioned in haunting formation, as if they had been standing at attention when the end came. Suzuki was in front, his officers behind him, the enlisted men in ranks. They had faced death as soldiers, even when death arrived as an invisible wall of fire. Patterson counted 68 bodies in total. Not a single man had survived. The concrete fortress designed to keep them safe had become their tomb. Yet, incredibly, Fort Drum itself had survived. The exterior walls showed scorching, but no structural failure. The gun turrets were warped but standing. The fort could have been repaired, but the age of coastal fortifications had ended that morning. Aircraft carriers and guided missiles rendered fixed defenses obsolete. Fort Drum was the strongest fortress in the world, and it was also the last one that mattered. Today, 78 years later, Fort Drum still stands in Manila Bay, a gray ghost guarding a harbor that no longer needs guarding. The access hatches remain welded shut. The ventilation shafts are blocked with concrete. It is technically a war memorial, but in reality, it is a mausoleum. The 68 Japanese soldiers remain inside, their bones resting in the darkness of the concrete hull. The attack remains a brutal lesson in the evolution of warfare. It marked the moment when engineering replaced courage as the decisive factor in combat. The concrete battleship was not defeated by bigger guns or braver soldiers. It was defeated by a chemical equation, a few pumps, and a commander who realized that the most dangerous enemy is the one who refuses to fight by the rules.